Okay, we're getting ready for your last assessment of the year, your last assignment of the year. And it involves the civil rights movement. As you can see on the screen there, we're going to concentrate on the years 1954 to 1968, half century ago. More than a half century ago that this period of time ended. The civil rights issues of the 1940s and 50s and 60s and beyond are still going on. Protests had to do with Jim Crow laws and second-class citizenship and lack of rights in America. And in February of this last year, the last month, full month that we were in school, a young man in Georgia, Ahmaud Arbery, was out jogging one day, and two guys decided that he had maybe committed a burglary, and they hopped in their pickup truck and they grabbed their weapons and they shot him down on the street. No due process of law, no police involved, just two guys deciding to shoot someone who just happened to be a black man jogging in their neighborhood. Apparently had nothing to do with any burglaries. So that's current events. The point is that these are issues that were raised 70, 80 years ago, played out 60, 50 years ago, and are still alive and important on this issue today. So let's take a quick look at it. What you're going to do is I'm going to give you an assessment, and I'm not going to give you any homework. You've already watched two crash courses. If you haven't watched the two crash courses, that's the first thing you should do right now. Turn this off, watch the two 1950s, 1960s crash courses, and then come back right here. I'll wait. I'll hold my breath. Okay, you're back. And now what we're going to do is spend a few minutes talking about this, and then you're going to take the assessment. There's no homework to be done. There's no work to be done, and you can use these notes, that is me talking over these slides, or just the slides themselves, as an open note type assessment. So let's get started. What should you know? Well, the first thing you should know is that there was a 2.5 century legacy of slavery that started in 1619 and didn't end until 1865, 246 years to be official, of slavery in British North America, the colonies, and then the United States, right up to and through the Civil War, and right to the passage and ratification of the 13th Amendment right at the end of the Civil War in 1865. So there's that. You have people who are deliberately kept uneducated and deliberately kept without any rights of any kind. That changes. That changes during the period of Reconstruction right after the war. And there was great resistance in the Confederate South to Reconstruction. The idea that the slaves would be freed was, I won't say accepted as much as it was endured, but the idea of full citizenship, voting rights, political rights, civil rights was resisted. And it was enforced by the United States Army and the United States government. That illustration in the upper left of the Army officer holding off a group of angry white Southerners in defense of some newly freed black Southerners standing in front of the American flag is just about right. In 1877, after 12 years of this battle to guarantee these rights, the federal government sort of abdicated its role, washed its hands of the matter, and left the white ex-Confederate Southerners to run the South. The result was the Jim Crow era, which we talked about back in January, in which a two-tiered system was set up of certain rights denied, many rights denied to African Americans, and equal use of facilities. In this case, a waiting room in a train station in the picture, but as we've talked about, water fountains and restrooms and schools and trolley cars and railroad trains and things like that. Which carried with it also the sharecropping system, which created a wage or debt type of slavery. If you owe money, you couldn't get out of a contract, and the contract would roll over. And there were people that were, their families had been sharecroppers from the 1880s through the 1970s. Beginning in the 20th century, with World War I and then extending through World War II, there was something called the Great Migration. This allowed many hundreds of thousands of African Americans to get out of basically the states of the old Confederacy and get to major cities, either in the North or in the far West, and earn a decent living, really for the first opportunity to do that. And that was sort of a catalyst for change. World War II was the big catalyst for change. I talked about anyway, when this was after we were out of school, the Double V campaign, that we're going to fight for freedom, and then because we're fighting for freedom, we're going to freedom in Europe, we're going to show that we deserve full freedom here in the United States. It would work that way. And in fact, there were a lot of rights that African Americans gained simply by being part of the war effort and opening up of defense factories to African American workers, and heroism of the Tuskegee Airmen and other African American soldiers was something to be an example of these people are great patriots working for freedom throughout the world. Why is there a double standard at home? There's a Tuskegee Airman right there. There's the Double V campaign. It was a conscious thing. Let us work hard to bring about the end of fascism, and let us then work hard to use that effort to bring about the end of Jim Crow. And after the war, it wasn't official government stuff. It wasn't politics. It was the world of sports. And people began to think in this kind of a sentence. If you can, in later years, when we put a man on the moon, people would say things like, well, if you can put a man on the moon, why can't you invent a carburetor that doesn't, the needles don't get gummed up? Shouldn't you be better than that? Couldn't you be able to do more than that? The 1940s were people that said, if you can fight for your country and die for your country, why don't you have rights within your country? One of the persons that said that was the president of the, at that time, Brooklyn Dodgers. If you've seen the movie 42, you've read about, or you've seen about Jackie Robinson, who broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball. And in breaking the color barrier, it kind of opened, again, a window. Hey, why wouldn't there be equality here? And soon it spread from the National League and the Brooklyn Dodgers to the American League and the Cleveland Indians. And by 1950, there were numerous African American baseball players, and it seemed like something that, why did it take so long for this to happen? That didn't mean that there wasn't prejudice against these young men. It meant that there had been a breakthrough. And soon there were African American players on numerous teams. The president, who was Harry Truman, believed that having segregated military units in its own right was ineffective and inefficient and a bad use of resources and also unfair. And he convened a committee on civil rights to study that and other matters, and he wanted to look at several things, and they came up with four major recommendations. And there you can see them. You could be asked a question about them, possibly. But the only one that came out of this that actually happened at the time, and they made the 4 recommendations, was the 4th one, to desegregate the military, because it was something that Truman, as commander-in-chief, the president as commander-in-chief, was able to do by an executive order. And in fact, he did issue an executive order desegregating the military. And then he asked Congress to pass a civil rights bill, which it didn't do at that time. And in fact, there was what came to be known as a white backlash against all of this. And it was spearheaded, again, in the old Confederacy, and a South Carolina politician by the name of Strom Thurmond, governor of South Carolina, was to run not as a Democrat against President Truman, who was also a Democrat, but as a Dixiecrat. At that time, Southerners, white Southerners, were almost all Democrats. Today, that is flipped for reasons that we're not going to really talk about in this class, and white Southerners, vast majority, are Republicans, as the political parties have kind of changed places in their stand on issues of civil rights. And the Dixiecrat effort failed, but what it did show is that there was a lot of opposition to changes in the Jim Crow system. And the other thing you need to know is that the system was based on the idea, as we have talked about over and over again, of separate but equal. And that was put in place by a Supreme Court decision called Plessy versus Ferguson. We've studied that. We studied that back in January, and that happened in the 1890s. And there was a companion Supreme Court case in the 1890s that okayed the poll tax and the grandfather clause and the literacy test, because none of those laws actually mentioned that African Americans were being targeted. It just happened to be that it applied to African Americans, if not 100%, which the grandfather clause did, at least 95, 96%, such as the poll tax. That was the law of the land. In the early 1900s, an organization called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded and made its activity to be fighting against Jim Crow and bringing court cases challenging Jim Crow type situations in the court of law. The man pictured there, Thurgood Marshall, was their chief attorney, and he would argue cases over and over whenever such a thing would come up. 1954, a case came to the Supreme Court, and it was about the case of a young girl by the name of Linda Brown of Kansas, Topeka, Kansas. And she was barred from attending a school next to her home. Instead, she had to find her own way to get to the all-black school on the other side of town. The NAACP argued this, and it made its way by 1954 up to the Supreme Court. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. Very important, one of the main things to know about this. By a 9-0 unanimous decision, the court ruled that segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. They said that separate was inherently not equal. They said that having separate facilities by race violated the idea of equality. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, said in the field of public education, separate facilities are inherently, that means just by their very nature, are not equal. There's no place for this. And they based this on the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which had been ratified right after the Civil War. We studied that also back in January, and one of the clauses of it guaranteed equal protection of the law for all citizens. By saying this is not equality, it's based on the idea that a school 7 miles from your house that is a less well-funded school than the one 2 blocks from your house is inequality if the only reason you're being sent there is because you happen to be black. Because this is about schools, it applies to schools, but because it's based on the 14th Amendment, equal protection, it now then applies to anything where equal protection becomes an issue. So it opened the floodgates for other things. Okay, and I'm not going to walk through those with you. You can be able to look as you take this assessment at these notes. But just do know that the Brown case opened up the floodgates of protesting many things based on it does not guarantee equal protection. Now, again, in the South, there was a backlash. There was the Southern Manifesto. It was condemned Brown, condemned Chief Justice Earl Warren, and basically condemned the whole process. Like I said, it opens the floodgates, and you'll read that. And in some places, and you can see the red line, the red marking there, in the South, you have de jure, that is by law, the Jim Crow laws, but even in places such as Ohio and other places in the North where there were no laws on the books, there was in fact, known as de facto segregation. So there were more than one type of problem to be dealt with here. Talked about Major League Baseball. There's Larry Doby, the first African American in the American Leagues, played for the Cleveland Indians, and he was a star player. But when the teams traveled and went to hotels in the various cities, he couldn't stay with the team because they were segregated. Not by law, but because that's what they did, de facto. So there were a bunch of organizations, and you should read through and see what these are. But what happens is after the Brown decision, people again started to think, well, if that's illegal, why isn't this illegal? Why do you have to ride on the back of the bus, for example? And this is very, very famous. It's the very next year. It's 1955. And when Miss Rosa Parks decided, she was sitting in the front of the bus, which was okay if there were no white passengers. But as soon as a white passenger got on the bus, the black passengers all had to crowd into the back. So there could be 30 people crowded into the back and one person in the front, but you can't sit, if you're black, in the section reserved for whites. She decided not to move. She was arrested. She was booked, and there was a bus boycott. And they boycotted riding the buses. Blacks did for a year. And they did it to economically cripple the bus line, but they also pursued a court case. This is not equal protection. And it just so happened that a young minister by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. Had his first ministry in Alabama there at that time, and he was put in charge of the response, and he led the movement, and that is kind of what propelled him to leadership in the civil rights movement thereafter. I said a year. It lasted 382 days, more than a year. And in the end, the legal challenge, again, worked its way through the courts. And in December of 1956, the Supreme Court declared Montgomery bus law was illegal, and again it was based on equal protection of the law. The protest was vindicated. And this established what the civil rights movement would be about, as led at that time, especially as per the philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr., which was something called civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is breaking laws that are unjust and also don't apply to everyone. So, for example, white people can ride in the front of the bus, black people can't. Riding in the bus is not an illegal activity, but it's an illegal activity if you ride in this seat in this situation. So the way they broke the law was to do a peaceful act of doing what would be legal, except they were not allowed to do it. Ride on a bus, sit down in a restaurant, go to a certain theater, whatever it might be. And there are a series of these incidents that go on. And we will leave you to look at them. The Little Rock Nine, desegregating the biggest high school in the state of Arkansas in 1957. And the violence and the fact that President Eisenhower had to send in the U.S. Army to protect these kids, and did so. Led to a Civil Rights Act and made this a priority of the U.S. Justice Department. The idea of getting full service in lunch counters or cafes. Again, not illegal to sit at the counter, illegal to sit at that counter and be served food if you happen to be black. So they sat there. They sat there. They were harassed. They were beaten on. But they eventually desegregated the lunch counters. And they did the same thing with the bus lines in the South. So I'm just going to let this go, and you can scroll your way through. We'll take a couple minutes in a second here to talk about how Birmingham, Alabama helped change the landscape once again. All right,